Greetings, chess endgame fans. Now in this video and the next one, the Waltzman is going to take a further look at two endings that were played in the 4NCL's online junior league. And this was a very successful event held over the lockdown period, with over 120 teams participating and nearly 4,500 games played. The positions are both rook and pawn endings. The first ending is on the board, and it's an ending of rook versus rook and rook's pawn. The second is an ending of rook versus rook and centre pawn, and so the two endings are a nice little complement to one another. As ever, the positions are chosen for their instructional value, and if you're coaching any promising juniors, you might like to show these endings to them. Also, as the players are amateurs as well as juniors, the Waltzman, as usual, is not going to identify them. Well, let's have a look at the first of these positions. White's got an extra h-pawn, though it currently stands on h2, the starting square. The queening square is, of course, h8. And at the moment, Black's king stands on b3, which is a long way away from the queening square. And so the position of his king is Black's major problem in this ending. On the other hand, White's rook stands rather passively placed on h7, guarding the h2 pawn, which is under attack from Black's rook, while White's king occupies one of the central squares, so it controls a lot of squares in the centre of the board. Okay, so the question for you is this. Putting all these factors together, do you think that Black can achieve a draw in this ending? And if you'd like to have a go at this problem, think about the position, pause the video here. Okay, well, welcome back if you decided to tackle this one. Well, let's first of all see what happened in the game. Black decided to give a check and went rook d2 check. Now, this was not a good move, and the reason it wasn't a good move is that White was able to gain a tempo. White can get out of check by going king e3, attacking the rook. And the problem is that Black can't go king c3 supporting the rook, because were he to do that, White would give a check on c7 with his rook, and that would win the rook d2. So instead the attack rook has to move away, supposing it moves to a2. Well, White can then push the h-pawn and go h4. And after king c4, trying to move the king over towards the h8 square, well, White's got an important resource. White can go rook h5. And the idea of this move is to cut the Black king off along the fifth rank. In endings, if you have the opportunity to cut your opponent's king off along a rank or along a file, particularly in rook endings, then it's usually a good idea. You should think very seriously about taking the opportunity. So note the importance of this idea. I note also that if White hadn't pushed immediately with h4, and if instead White had gone king f4 with the idea of the king supporting the advance of the pawn, well, that would have been a mistake. Black would again reply king c4 with the same idea as before, getting the king over. But now if White goes rook h5, then Black's king can keep coming. It can go king d4. And after h4 is played, Black checks with rook f2. And this presents White with a problem, because for that h-pawn to advance, it's going to need the support of White's king. But if White goes king g5, the king obstructs the effectiveness of the rook. And that means that Black's king can take advantage and cross the fifth rank with king e5. Well, although White can give a discovered check with king g6, all that does is it nudges Black in the direction of travel that he wants to take. Black's very happy to go king e6. White might go king g7, trying to control the queening square and the squares surrounding it, but Black's king just shadows and goes king e7. And now in order for the h-pawn to advance, the White rook is going to have to get out of the way of its path. So White might go rook e5 check here. But just as before, as we saw with rook d2, that's not a problem because black can get out of check and pick up a tempo by attacking the rook on e5, which has to give way, has to go back to, say, e3, out of reach. But black's rook will then attack the h-pawn with rook h2. And the white king is too far away to defend that pawn, so white has to defend it with rook e4. But now black can attack the rook again with king d5. Notice how much work black's king is doing in this ending. It's become a very active piece indeed. White slides the attacked rook over to g4, and then immediately black's king starts headed again for that h8 square. Well, white's king is going to have to advance the advance of the h-pawn. It goes king g6. But black's king, again, reacts by going king e7 with the idea of going behind the enemy king. And after h5, black does indeed go king f8. And now black's king is sufficiently well placed for this ending to be a draw. There's no way that white can any longer force through the advance of the h-pawn to become a queen. So let's go back. The key was to advance immediately with h4, and after king c4, rook h5, then the d4 square is no longer available to black's king, and that's an important point. Okay, so what is black to do? Well, black can try the move rook h2, attacking the pawn, but white's king will come over and it's going to harass the rook on h2. Black improves the position of his king, but now white has a further resource. The white rook can swing over to a5. And the rook is very well placed on this square because when white's king gets to g5, it's no longer going to blunt the effectiveness of the rook, and white will still have this blockade along the fifth rank, still be cutting off black's king. And notice also that the h-pawn is defended tactically. Black can't capture it because if he takes the h-pawn, white's got rook a4 check, and white would win the black rook by means of a skewer. What black can try though is the move rook h3 check. And now white's got to be careful. You've got to make sure that the king goes in the right direction. So a mistake would be to go king g2. And the reason is that black has the resource rook e3. And notice how all of a sudden it's white's king that's cut off along the third rank. And if white goes h5 here, well, black can go rook e5, attacking the rook and the h-pawn. And if black takes the rook, black plays king takes rook. And this is a drawn king and pawn ending because the king is within the square of the pawn. Remember that if your king is within the square of a passed pawn, it means you're always going to be in time to stop the pawn and it won't be able to become a queen. So let's go back. After this sneaky rook h3 check, it's very important that white goes in the right direction and plays king to g4. Black's rook is attacked and it drops back to h1, and now white can push the pawn. And after king e4, he can go king g5. Still got the fifth rank cut off, and that h-pawn is going to advance towards the queening square supported by the white king. And because black's king can't come to the aid of the rook, that pawn is going to cost black a rook and the game. Okay, let's go back to the start position. So all of black's problems stem from the fact that he gave white a helping hand. But instead of giving a useless check on d2, black could improve by going king b4. And after white pushes h4, the black king carries on going with king b5. Now, at first sight, you might wonder, well, what is this really gaining black? His king is still a long way from the h8 queening square. Started off on b3, is still on the b file. That's 5 files away from the h file. Why is this good for black? Well, we'll see in a few moves' time that advancing the king in this way has an important secondary objective. So from here, white might go king d5, trying to shoulder barge black's king. King keeps going, it goes to b6. And white plays the same idea, shoulder barging, it goes to d6. And white's plan is straightforward. He wants to advance the h-pawn, and when he gets sufficiently close to the queening square, he's going to bring his king over to support it, and swing his rook over maybe to the e7 square, cutting black's king off, and winning black's rook for the h-pawn. And at first sight, it doesn't seem as though there's much that black can do to frustrate this plan, with his king stuck on b6. But if you look more deeply into the position, it turns out that there are some resources for black. So black starts off by going rook g6 check. And after king e5, he plays the important move rook g4, attacking the h-pawn. And that's important because it restricts white. White can't move his rook off the h-file because that would lead to a loss of the pawn. What he can do, though, is attack the rook. He can play king f5. And now there's another important move. Black goes rook c4. Now it's very important that black plays this move. The idea is to operate along the c-file. Notice that there's no obstruction to the rook. It's free to operate along that file. And also, because the king is on b6, tucked out of the way, the rook is also free to give these lateral checks from c7, c6, c5 or c4. And this is going to be black's idea. He's going to just rely on the rook to frustrate white's plans with his king tucked out of the way. And this type of setup is known as the Vancura defense. And it's named after the endgame study composer Joseph Vancura, who discovered it early in the 20th century. Okay, so after h5, rook c5 check, king e4, let's go rook g5, keeping an attack on the h-file. So that more or less forces the h-pawn to advance to h6. And now black goes rook g6, staying on the enemy h-pawn. In a Vancura defense, you always want to be using your rook either to attack the enemy pawn or to check from distance the enemy king. Okay, after king f5, rook c6, king g5, we actually reach a formal Vancura position, where again black's going to try and hold the draw with his rook, with his king keeping out of the way. So first of all, black goes rook c5 check. That move's okay because it checks the white king from distance. And after white goes king f4, let's go rook c6. And that's okay because it's attacking the enemy pawn. That's consistent with our rule. White might go king e4, but we can go rook c4 check. And after king d5, we can go rook c5 check. So again, all the time, we're either giving check or we're attacking the enemy pawn. White goes king d4. There's no check in the position, so we must go rook c6, attacking h6. And now to make progress, white goes rook h8, and he wants to swing his rook over to b8 to check black's king. Ideally, after playing h7. So there's an important move that black needs to make here. We go king b7. And that prevents white from giving an annoying check on b8. White tries to harass black's rook. But notice the other advantage of putting the king on b7 is we can go rook a6. again cutting the white king off along the 6th rank. And if white goes h7, then we can go rook h6, maintaining an attack on the passed pawn. And because the king is on b7, well, there's no 9th file. I mean, white can't move his rook to the a-1 file in order to skewer the black king and win black's rook if it captures the h7. There are only 8 files on the board, and the king is on b7, so that's just not going to work. So the only thing white can do is to move his king across to try and harass the black rook on h6. And now a mistake would be to play king c7, and then white would go rook a8, and after rook takes h7 he would play rook a7 check, and he would skewer and win black's rook. But instead black can simply mark time. He can play king a7. He's not going to follow the white king. He's not going to be suckered into losing the game in that way. King f5, black again can go to b7, that's a safe square. And after king g5, white can simply move his rook back to h1, and he can check at distance, giving these vertical checks. And this is a well-known theoretically drawn position. Okay, well, let's go back. After king b4, there's one more try for white, and that is to go rook h5 immediately, cutting the black king off along the 5th rank. Now black's got several options to meet this move, but I think the neatest is to go rook g4 check. And now if white goes king e5, well, he's released black's king. Black's king could now cross the 5th rank. He can go king c5. And after h4, he can go king c6. And he's improving the position of his king. And he's going to have one of the drawing setups that we've discussed earlier. On the other hand, though, if white goes king e3, ducking below the 4th rank, well, black has this nice move rook c4. And if white goes h4, then black can play rook c3 check. And he's got these harassing checks, harassing lateral checks. And if white tries rook d5 with the idea of going rook d4, then again, black's got rook c3 check. And the idea of this move is if white goes rook d3, black says thank you very much, trades the rooks, and it's a drawn king and pawn ending because black's king is close enough to the h file and the queening square to draw that ending. You might like to verify that yourself after the video. While if white goes king f4, then black can go rook h3, attacking the pawn. White has to go rook d2, defending it. And now you won't be surprised for black to play king c3, a tempo gaining move, attacking the rook. The rook maybe goes to g2, and black starts headed off for the h8 square. He goes king d4, and after king g4, black moves his rook as far away as possible, and he's going to start mounting a frontal defense. He's now got the possibility of checking from distance from the 1st rank. White might play rook e2, trying to cut the black king off along the e file, but notice that there are only 3 files separating black's king from the h file, and there needs to be at least 4 files for white to be able to win, and we'll see why that is in a few moves time. Black's plan is going to be to get his king to the queening square, and he's got time to do this by moving along the sides of this rectangle within the board. Let's just see how this works out. So black goes king d5, moving along the rectangle. White pushes h4. Black keeps going along the rectangle, plays king d6. White goes h5. Black goes king d7. Now, in order to make progress, that pawn needs to be supported by the king. The rook can't simultaneously cut the black king off and support the pawn, so white has to go king g5. And now, you see the point of black's play, he can go rook e8. And because there are only 3 files separating the king from the pawn, then exchanging rooks leads to a drawn king and pawn ending. So instead, white might try rook f2. Black's king immediately gets in front of the rook, gets closer to that queening square. White goes king g6. And now it's important to check on g8. And the idea is that after king h7, black can play rook f8. And again, trading rooks brings about a drawn king and pawn ending. So white might try rook a2. Black's king gets closer to the queening square, goes king f7. White checks on a7. Black goes king f6. And now if white goes h6, then rook f7 check. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. And again, black has achieved a drawn king and pawn ending. So a very instructive ending indeed. And remember that rook's pawns are much less likely to be exchanged than center pawns. And so studying these endings is always a good idea, because it may help you a lot in practical play. So the main lesson from this video is the importance of improving the position of your king if you're defending, to get over to the queening corner, or to force a drawn king and pawn ending, or to set up a Vancura defense. And for the attacking side, we saw the importance of cutting the enemy king off along a rank or along a file, but you want to be cutting your opponent's king off at least 4 files from the H file. Okay, well, in the next video we will look at a center pawn. Thanks for watching.